In 45 minutes in Forethought, Molly Naylor will explore what we can learn from our teenage selves. First, live as usual, it's time for the Moral Maze with Michael Burke.
Good evening. Dominic Cummings didn't pull any punches in the paper he wrote as he's coming to the end of his time as policy advisor to the Education Secretary, Michael Gove. What's interesting is that when it was leaked, it wasn't his sometimes excoriating analysis of what's wrong with our education system that caused a furore. No, what lit the blue, or rather red, touch paper were his views on the latest advances in behavioural genetics and how they should influence what happens in schools. The latest genetic research, based on a long-term study of more than 10,000 identical twins born between 1994 and 1996, has dropped a bombshell of scientific evidence into the old nature versus nurture debate. For instance, the researchers say it shows that the differences between pupils' performance in GCSE exams has more to do with their genes than all the other factors, schooling, family, environment, put together. They're careful to say these results tell us about populations, not individuals. It's about probability, not prophecy. Nonetheless, in a book based on the research, two of the scientists call for genetically sensitive schools, where education is tailored to the strengths and weaknesses of individual pupils. This is trampling into an area that has become almost taboo. It's not just alarmed those who see the return of elitism, with a genome test at 6 months perhaps, instead of an exam at 11+. To some it has the smell of eugenics. What should we do with the genetic information that will soon be at our fingertips? How should we respond to the increasingly measurable heritability of traits that we may regard as desirable or otherwise? That's our Moral Maze tonight. Our panel, the social commentator Melanie Phillips, the former Conservative Cabinet Minister Michael Portillo, Matthew Taylor, Chief Executive of the RSA, and the often troubled, sometimes troublesome, Anglican priest Giles Fraser. And this sort of thing troubles you immensely, doesn't it, Giles?
Well, the double helix is not about fate and it's not about destiny, but I think some people do tend to use it that way. I think, predestination was a pretty bad theological doctrine, and I think it make a worse scientific one too.
Michael Portillo?
I don't think it's anything to do with that. The more we know about our genes, the better we're going to be able to fight things like disease and educational disadvantage. Now, all knowledge can be put to good purposes or bad purposes. I think there clearly is a good purpose to which this knowledge can be put, and fighting against having the knowledge is not a good way to start.
Matthew Taylor.
Yeah, I'm not worried about the science, although I think we should recognise it's far from uncontested. But I am concerned that science leads to a kind of reductionist view of what human life is for and where its value lies. And I also think this science is very rarely useful in making practical policy, including in relation to education.
Melanie Phillips.
I'm suspicious of heritability research. I think it's based on some rather flawed and rather dubious assumptions, and I fear it's a kind of way of getting eugenics by the back door. I think that everyone has potential. I think it's wrong to assume that that potential is limited, and I think the purpose of education is to fulfil everyone's potential, and in that purpose, genetics is all but irrelevant.
Panel, thanks very much indeed. The first witness is Dr Kathryn Asbury, who is the co-author with Professor Plomin of G is for Genes. She's a research psychologist at York University and was involved in all that twin research, or using all that twin research. In a sentence, whatever is a genetically sensitive school?
It's not something that we have at the moment, not something that we're likely to have for a little while, but basically it would be a school that personalises learning effectively for all children by understanding their biological and social backgrounds, and therefore supports all children better in fulfilling their individual potential.
And to what extent is genetic research of this kind going to influence the way that would operate, in your view?
We don't currently know. What we know is that we've got decades of behavioural genetic research, which gives us very reliable heritability estimates for a range of academic abilities and aptitudes. And we just want to start a conversation about whether there is a possible application, whether that science can be used to make education work better for all children.
Matthew Taylor?
Well, you've certainly started that conversation. I know quite a lot about health policy, but I wouldn't assume that I could diagnose someone medically. You're a scientist. Why do you think you're in a position to be able to develop policy recommendations?
I absolutely don't, and that's not what...
But your book contains policy recommendations.
It does, but what we're very careful to say in the book, our book has 11 chapters where we lay out the scientific evidence in a way that we hope is more accessible than behavioural genetics is often written about in academic journals. And at the end, we say we want this conversation to happen. We want to talk about whether there's an application and whether our research can make schools better, whether our knowledge is useful. And we start the ball rolling by laying out some policy ideas that are in line with the evidence that we have, and then we do a sort of line drawing of a genetically sensitive school.
But what kind of moral debate did you have before you wrote the latter chapters of your book, before you got into those policy recommendations? What kind of moral dilemmas did you have to tangle with before you felt that you could write those chapters?
I don't feel that we had to deal with moral dilemmas particularly, because all we were saying was, this is the knowledge, how can we use it? We completely appreciate that science is based on evidence and fact, and that policy and politics are based on values. So I think in the recommendations that we suggest as ideas, you can see our values. So we have stepped outside of the boundary of being scientists there.
Did it? I mean, presumably, it must have occurred to you that what would happen is exactly what has happened, which is that what is being talked about as a result of your research is not really your idealistic view of a child-centred school. I wouldn't have any problem with that. But the idea that this is science that can be used to sort children into the bright and the less bright, and that implicitly we might want to put more resources into the bright children so that, for example, we can compete more effectively on the global stage. Are you surprised at that interpretation of your work?
No, we're not surprised, but actually
didn't
being
give you
here
pause
and
for
talking...
thought before delving into the area of policy?
Well, it was a big motivator for delving in, really. We want to change the conversation. We want to say genetics is not scary. It's got this very bad image problem. The words are hard and difficult, and you do get people reacting very angrily.
This is what I don't understand. I don't understand why you didn't just write a book about genetics. And actually, what you argue in the book isn't particularly new. It's broadly in line, as I understand it, with most scientific views about the heritability of intelligence.
Yes,
I don't understand why you wanted then to add the policy stuff into this. And also, before you get into that policy, there would be a fundamental question, I think, which would be this. Imagine if we were behind a veil of ignorance, if we had no idea what our genetic inheritance was going to be. Do you think we would rather a world in which that genetic inheritance was taken to be something which the authorities used in however benign a form to determine our prospects, or would we rather live in a world where, actually, regardless of our genetic inheritance, we'd want a society where we were given the opportunity to fulfil our potential, to choose the path that we chose ourselves? That's a fundamental moral choice. Did you consider that?
Yes, we did, and we hope that our ideas make that more possible for more children, that we can create a world in which there are equal opportunities for children to fulfil their potential.
Who can create it?
Educational policymakers.
Giles Fraser.
There's a long history of people using genetics for political purposes, sometimes
Yes.
very dodgy political purposes. Were you really not anxious that this was going to happen here?
We were, and to a certain extent it's begun to happen already, but we're trying to change the dialogue, we're trying to change the image and get across. I think there's a widespread misunderstanding about what heritability is. I think it's a word that really confuses people, and when the Cummings paper came out a few weeks ago, it really confused people and was reported very badly in the press. So we're taking opportunities like the opportunity here tonight to explain what it actually means and why it's not something to be threatened by.
But given the confusion and how difficult some of these things are, don't you feel that that is prime territory to be manipulated by people who have political agendas who want to use this in a particular way? And you sort of nod to me, but then you also said to Matthew, I didn't have to deal with any moral dilemmas about this, and I'm trying to fit those things together.
Well, I don't think we have I don't think scientists ever have control over how their science is applied in practice. We're trying to be part of the conversation about using it well. We want to figure out how to use emerging genetic technologies and behavioural genetic evidence well to the benefit of society, and we're trying to create a conversation that allows people to talk about it properly without getting sensationalist and scaremongering.
But that's a bit naive. I mean, it seems to me it's naive. I mean, there are some people who, for instance, have a very ideological commitment to streaming in education, and so that they'll leap on this and show this is absolutely grist to that particular mill, and what they're really doing, just like in the way that happened with Cyril Burt and the 11+, those sorts of studies about twins, those studies about the relationship between genetics and intelligence and so forth were actually the sort of prime motivation for the 11 plus, and actually people who defended the 11 plus very keen to have this sort of thing going on.
Yes, but we are prepared to stand up and say that's not what the evidence dictates that we should do, and that actually, in our opinion, our research can be used most effectively to support the most vulnerable learners in society, and that's what we would like to see happen.
But that's nice of you, but you don't actually get that power. I mean, what happens if someone uses this sort of research, you know, and where it goes in the future to go, OK, let's have streaming at birth, as it were. I mean, let's just take a swab and we work out what you are, and streaming at birth. I mean, that sort of thing should scare us all.
It should, of course it should, but there would be no scientific support for that kind of approach. And we're trying to communicate the science better so that people don't think that there is.
You don't think there's something Pollyanna-ish about that? In the sense that, you know, I mean, you're saying here this would be used to support the most vulnerable in society. It's much historical evidence for that.
There isn't much historical evidence, but there's no reason why the future can't be different to the past.
Indeed. Dr Asbury, thank you very much indeed. Next witness is Steve Davey, who was a pupil and now teaches children up to year 6 at the Wroxham School, Potter's Bar, a school dedicated to the philosophy of learning without limits. That means, according to the website anyway, those limits are, and I quote, determinist beliefs about ability, which you're against, or the limitations that imposed. So we're all equally able, are we? Or potentially able anyway, and we're not, it's not the result of genetic luck.
Well, at the Wroxham we're very careful on the language we use around learning, views around intelligence and ability. We're very concerned that by using language like ability and intelligence, we're going to promote a negative view around learning and progression and aspirations for children. So we don't set by ability. We allow the children to choose their level of differentiation or challenge, as we call it, in each lesson. We're trying to build a sense of self in the child where they are aware of their own strengths and their own skills and the areas that they need to develop in order to perhaps be a better scientist or debater, for instance. And we try to forge that sense of self in them so they are feeling empowered, that they are making these decisions, that they have an effect and an influence on their future.
Melanie Phillips.
So you don't set or stream by ability or intelligence in any way.
No.
It seems to me then that that's got nothing specifically to do with the issue of genetics. You simply don't accept that one child is more able than another?
I think we're more concerned about this definition of able and where that's coming from. It's a very subjective issue, and I think this debate has really opened up an issue around what a school's for and what is education for.
Okay, but let me just stop you there if you don't mind.
No problem.
Do you actually personally believe that no one is more able than anyone else? I mean, I don't wish to give you a semantic dilemma here, but I mean, is it so difficult to decide whether somebody's more able than anyone else?
But what area are you talking? Are you talking about able to pass a GCSE or able to succeed in the PISA tables, or are we talking about their influence in society and their ability to progress through jobs?
Able in the educational environment,
okay, yeah.
Able to understand what's being taught, able to understand different levels of difficulty in, say, the teaching of mathematics. No child is more or less able?
Thank you for clarifying. No, that's absolutely fine. I will say children in my class, maybe I wouldn't use the word able.
Why not?
Because it has a negative connotation. It denotes it's fixed. It doesn't allow for the child to...
Why does it denote it's fixed? I'm sorry to interrupt you, but this is so fascinating.
Yeah.
Because what I'm trying to get at is why you somehow think these things are fixed. There's kind of it's like a determinism.
Okay.
Just to say that a child can do something another child can't do.
We would call it working levels. A child is currently working at this level.
Okay.
And then we would look at what's the next level, perhaps in mathematics. Okay, applying mathematics or applying mathematical skills.
Yeah.
What's